Welcome to this perhaps half an hour reflection on. I have some notes here. I mean, I can call that at best scattered reflections on how we would study culture during, in the wake of pandemics, as I have titled it. Uh, for the past few months, I have had uh, many stages, or should I say, online virtual stages, platforms, where they have asked me to talk about literature in the wake of pandemics, and I did also. Like I have talked on quite a few stages, on quite a few platforms, and I have also written on how we changed the way we read literature in the wake of a pandemic. Literature, as you know, I mean, uh, there is a long history of representing diseases in literature from the epics onwards. Like thinking about how Iliad or Odyssey or Mahabharata or Ramayana or Popul Vuh, any of the grand epics. And Gerson is leaving. He's thanking us all, and thank you and Gerson for the poetry and for the insights. Well, yeah, coming back to what I was telling, we know how literature uh, meticulously reflected, represented ways of human ways of making sense, human ways of making sense of pandemics. So when something like a pandemic hit an ancient society, a prehistoric society, it was a mystery for them. It was something that they found difficult to explain. They definitely did not have microscopes. They did not have this germ theory to explain diseases. So it was very difficult for the ancient society, prehistoric societies, to understand the true nature, if this is the true nature. I mean, what we now have, there are contingents, right? Like medical anthropology is a discourse, is a discipline where there are contentions as to whether the current understanding of disease is the real understanding of disease. They call for a holistic understanding of disease, which includes so many other variables. Anyways, the kind of understanding that we have now calls for a certain kind of representation of pandemics in the contemporary literature. Disease generally, I'm not referring to only pandemics. Pandemics is like one class of disease. Okay, so diseases get represented in various ways in literature. My point is, I've been talking about literature and the ways of representation of diseases in literature. I've been talking about how Susan Sontag onwards, literary theorists have painstakingly tried to investigate the cultural connotations of pandemics, etc., etc. Now, if that study really has to be, if one has to really take that line of thought forward, like thinking about pandemics uh, and in connection with literature, if that line of thought is to be taken forward fruitfully, meaningfully, probably we will need to address the very discipline called cultural studies. And we might we should perhaps see how the discipline of cultural studies can reform itself, re-establish itself, reconfigure itself in the wake of the changed everyday life. Everyday life and everyday life practices are so crucial to the understanding of cultural studies as a discipline. So, in the wake of pandemic, the study of culture as such demands not just a stock taking, but also a redrafting of the vision. And this is my point of contention in today's talk. As I said, this is a projection from my understandings of how reading of literature should change in the wake of pandemics. I'm tempted to also put forth the idea that this is the only pandemic that in my 38 years of life, this is the only pandemic that I have witnessed, I have experienced. Most of us in this audience, we have not been in societies that were hit by smallpox or plague. We haven't experienced those things. We have experienced perhaps a dengue or malaria. We have had a slight pandemic-like situation breaking out when Nipah was reported in Perambra and Kutyadi. But definitely, this is going to be a breaking point in, like years later, if we live, say, to be an 80 or 100. Probably we will think back and think back on 2019, 20, 21, as Close was trying to say, 2013, 14, 23, even like you have this 2019, it began, and I don't know, even though the vaccines are in place, the next year, 2022, 23, 24, there will be this thing is here to stay, and it'll have bad death tolls, perhaps, or like controlled death tolls. I don't know. I mean, the government's vaccine, medical discourse, all sorts of things will basically decide what's going to happen in the coming few years, and how everyday life will have to adjust with the pandemic, how everyday life will have to find resistances, new modes of resistances towards the pandemic, etc., etc., etc. Now, the thing is, when such a situation happens, once in a lifetime situation, when something like this happens, what are the disciplines, like we people who deal with knowledge, we people who live live inside a university for most of the time, like we who transact knowledge, we who produce knowledge, we who consume knowledge, we who process knowledge, we who organize knowledge, we who try like disseminate knowledge, we people who deal with knowledge, what happens to the practices of knowledge transaction when something like this happens? Do we not feel that the disciplines that we are teaching, like think of economics, for instance, an economics teacher will definitely feel like the economic theories that he or she has been transacting in the classroom will now need to be informed by the pandemic situation. Like how, as a literature teacher, I have felt that when I teach Keats, John Keats, in the classes, like in 2021, 22, when I go to a class, when I teach them Otto Nightingale, when I talk to them about TB, I might actually have more of an empathy towards Keats, who was living in a sanatorium in Rome when he was writing Otto Nightingale. We will be able to be we will be able to be more empathetic to, say, novels like Magic Mountain or Death in Venice or Plague, for instance, or when we read The Jar of the Plague Year, we might find ourselves, empathizing with the characters better. It is not just about empathizing; it's also about understanding the logic of representing them in a certain pattern. It is also about understanding quarantine, understanding isolation. Like a few years back, when I read Blindness, Saramago's Blindness, a decade back, when Saramago's Blindness came and I read it, I took it as a modern fable. But now, looking into Saramago's Blindness is a totally different experience. Well, this is me as a literature teacher. So the same with somebody who's teaching commerce in my college, somebody who teaches economics in my college, somebody who teaches biology, zoology in my college, biochemistry in my college, in my university. So they'll all feel that their disciplines ask for a certain redrafting, reconfiguration. I mean, the discipline is not something that you find in the textbook. It's not dead, right? Our disciplines are alive, organic. We deal with disciplines as culture, not as not as texts, not as dead texts. We look at the disciplines that we occupy, or the disciplines that accommodate us. We look at them as frameworks that are organic, frameworks that are alive, frameworks that are vibrant, frameworks that are responsive. So if that is the case, if that is how it works, we have to be able to like talk about how culture and maybe ways of understanding culture in the wake of pandemic, how that idea becomes more visible, how that idea becomes more real to us. The movies, the songs, literature, generally we consider these ideas to comprise our cultural sensibility. So if we need to talk about a sensibility, these are the coordinates that we generally use. These are the referral points that we generally use. But I'm not limiting this talk. I'm not limiting this perspective. I'm not limiting I said these are scattered reflections, but I'm not trying to limit the scattered reflections to how movies have changed. It is easy to do that. Like you can see how movies have changed. Okay, they have reopened the theaters. People have started visiting the theaters. But you see, theaters are struggling to look at all the posters, look at all the advertisement campaigns. They said the second shows are now on, and we are moving beyond the COVID. See, the COVID has actually marked its place in the theater. You know, like famous economists would say, economy, finance is like it's like a cycle ride. Once the cycle stops, the speed that the cycle had before it stopped, you cannot just re-begin it from that particular speed. You need to again start from zero. So we feel that the movie industry, the theater industry, as it existed once, as it existed before pandemic, it is not going to revive anytime soon. It starts from zero, and then it will gain momentum perhaps, and then end up in a position where it was before the COVID outbreak. Same with theater. Theater is even more pathetic. Theater is treated like a secondary activity. Theater activity is treated like a secondary artistic activity. The International Theater Festival did not happen in Kerala, whereas International Film Festival happened. There are controversies. Of course, you must be aware of that, isn't it? Theaters are not being allowed. The licenses are not still sanctioned from the government. Theaters are not performing now. Films are being shown now. Theater suffers worse. Um, Movies have suffered, but theaters are suffering worse from this. Literature has become completely different. We have started reading more from the feed in the sense like the Google feed, the news feed, or let us say the online news media. The online news media has become absolutely important, absolutely relevant, absolutely a part of our daily feed during the COVID. The print has actually shelved itself. The print is taking a step back. And you can see that online marketing of books has become supremely important in the wake of COVID-19. So what I'm trying to say is these are visible changes. My point is, like usual fields of culture, usual fields that we mark as cultural fields, like the movie field, the literature field, the theater field. Visibly, there are issues. Visibly, there are changes. So they are out there, but there are also subtler, invisible, hidden kind of changes. Places where changes need to be, the changes have happened, but nobody has noticed that changes have happened, especially in disciplines that we teach in universities. And that is why I would use this umbrella term culture and not say literature or movies or something that is like a component. Well, in fact, the study of literature or the study of films, study of cinema, the study of theater, these have all kind of converted, evolved into something that we now call cultural studies. In that sense, we are talking about that discipline. We are talking about the discipline of cultural studies and how cultural studies will have to take in variables that come from, the changes in everyday life put there or like installed there because of the outbreak of COVID. So this is broadly the angle that I want to like follow, the angle that I want to inquire, the angle that I want to research, later. But now I'm trying to reflect upon how cultural studies evolve its perspective, and how in the last few years, just before the COVID outbreak happened, and Akash says during the pandemic connections. Yeah, we'll get back to that question. Literary text, literature, or culture. Let us come down to like these component parts after looking at cultural studies as a discipline that tries to, and interact with it, that tries to, encounter something like a pandemic. The text that we usually revisit in order to understand how cultural studies forms a response to situations like this. One of the main texts is definitely Susan Sontag's Illness as a Metaphor. Now, Illness as a Metaphor, like a text that came like 3-4 decades back, it made its points with a vigorous sense of interdisciplinarity. It called for a radical interdisciplinary approach. The text discussed in detail metaphors associated to cancer and tuberculosis. Of course, she had an additional essay. She had added an additional essay later where she discussed the metaphors of AIDS and its metaphors. So, anyways, like even with that included, AIDS, cancer, and tuberculosis, Susan Sontag was trying to put together an interdisciplinary perspective. And if we were to take stock of the disciplines that she joined together, the disciplines that she touched upon in Illness as a Metaphor. Well, these would be. I mean, I've tried to like amass a few uh, quotes, amass a few, like put together a few ideas that she had made in Illness as a Metaphor. But I'm not going to read out from Illness as a Metaphor. I want to do a meta study of what happened in Illness as a Metaphor. As a cult, as the pioneering work in cultural studies, what exactly did Illness as a Metaphor achieve? So this is the first question. So in one sweep, we can say uh, she had put together several branches of social sciences together. So you have it's like an intersection of several branches of social sciences. What you have in Illness as a Metaphor. So you will have particularly sociology, anthropology, and humanities, including literature. So you have literature definitely, and then sociology is the and anthropology is the, and you have more broadly uh, restlessness, a kind of irritation towards the confining nature of uh, disciplines. If we were to really look at a new discourse or new discipline like medical anthropology, we would perhaps say Sontag was inaugurating the thoughts that will eventuate in the establishment of a discipline called medical anthropology. But let that be the at in 1970s, in early 1970s, this idea of putting together different disciplines in order to understand the cultural texts of pandemics, something that was done by Susan Sontag in that particular text. It included discussions of anthropology, it included discussions of history, it included discussions of politics, it included discussions of sociology, it included discussions of literature. So this inquiry develops as one of the you know very important parts in cultural sciences, in cultural studies. What Sontag was trying to do will basically involve our understanding of cultural studies as a postmodern discipline. And coming down to something like the COVID-19, thinking about the situation that is engendered by COVID-19 in 2000, from 2019 onwards, 2019, 2020, the entire year, and the present situation. What exactly perspired, what exactly happened, will need to be taken as a break in that path of that inquiry of cultural studies. In the sense, see, the pandemic that we are now experiencing, the pandemic situation that we are now going through, is not like the pandemic situation engendered by cancer or, say, TB. There are points of comparison, but the points of contrast are absolutely visible. TB was characterized differently in the East and the West. In the West, it was seen as a fashionable disease. It was seen as consumption. In the East, it was known as triumph, or it's like, it's like a loss, not a consumption. In the West, it was attached to glamour. It was attached to heightened sensitivity, heightened emotionality, poetry. Like, you would attach, Dylan Thomas would attach Keatsian poetry to Keatsian condition of tuberculosis. One of the major arguments in illnesses metaphor is that tuberculosis has been touted as one of the most fashionable diseases ever in the history of human world. Okay, and then she contrasts that with cancer. Cancer as an ostracizing disease. Cancer as a disease that occupies the other end of the spectrum. So this is how she tries to make sense of cancer and tuberculosis in illness as metaphor. Look at the COVID situation. The situation of COVID-19, the situation that is engendered by COVID-19, it calls for new metaphors. We use the vocabulary that is applied to us by the earlier pandemics, like quarantine, for instance. Quarantine is a word that was first used in case of in case of leprosy. So leprosy, lepers were quarantined, and then you have tuberculosis, TB patients. They were quarantined. Sanatoriums were given. They were transferred to sanatorium. They lived in sanatorium. So quarantine was used, ostracization was used. Vaccine, definitely, I mean, it comes from the germ theory onwards. You have people talking about vaccine and the military metaphors that we constantly use in the case of COVID-19, fighting the virus, fighting the COVID-19. You situate yourself as on one side of the fight, one side of the war, trying to like conquer this disease. Like the virus is your enemy, like the virus is an encroachment into the calm and all peaceful scenario that humans occupied before it actually broke out. So the military metaphors that we associate with it, like the struggle of the body and the struggle of the individual body, physical body, and the struggle of the social body against an encroachment. So the metaphors of the military metaphors that we associate with COVID, the metaphors of isolation that we associate with COVID, these have all been there. These have all been this vocabulary has been there. Culture contained the vocabulary. And most recently, I mean, just before COVID-19 broke out, the last iteration of these metaphors were when the last iteration was when the Spanish flu broke out. During the Spanish flu, which was not a global pandemic like this. The Spanish flu was confined to certain parts of the Western world. It did not actually make its way to the Eastern hemisphere. So we did not actually knew these metaphors, but in spaces like Spain or Mexico, definitely, they know what is Spanish flu. People who were attacked by people who the communities that were quarantined, the communities that were supposed to like keep a lockdown. We people who live in Kerala, we have just before COVID broke out, we had specters of the Nipah virus, and the confusion and the panic that we underwent when the Nipah virus attack, kind of broke out. There is another question that comes up. I cannot. It doesn't stay on my screen. It basically disappears. We'll get back to the question after I make. I mean, I'll take another 5 minutes to, conclude this particular you know, I'll conclude this reflection on how COVID-19 and this pandemic is different and how it informs cultural studies in a totally different way. Now, yeah, if you look at the discipline of cultural studies as such, cultural studies has always had this urge to resist being shut down into a one discipline. Like when you study culture using cultural studies framework, you would find that there is no particular framework or methodology that cultural studies relies upon, and you have like people like Richard Johnson saying that cultural studies has been perennially anxious about. I'm quoting from Richard Johnson. So you have cultural studies has been perennially anxious about the possibility that it might be institutionalized and disciplined, and so lose its ability to plunder the more established disciplines while remaining separate from them. And then you know how people like Richard Hogarth, Raymond Williams, Stuart Hall, Michel Dessertu, or Pierre Bourdieu, or John Frow, how these people contributed to the development of cultural studies, and how increasingly, like if you look at Raymond Williams and Richard Hogarth, the first two titans of this particular field, the field of study as like designated as cultural studies, studying culture according to them was not really studying everyday practices, especially in books like in texts like culture and environment, that the one of the late books by Raymond Williams. You have culture and society, and you have culture and environment. In culture and society, he would say how we surrender to a characteristically industrialist or urban nostalgia. I'm quoting from Raymond Williams. And then in cultural environment, he criticizes Lewis's school's primer for deriving its notion of lived experience solely from literary sources. So, Richard Hogarth and Raymond Williams, the first two like originary points of cultural studies, two pioneers who sought to address culture in the wake of pandemics. They looked at culture as something that has been constructed by the past and something that current contemporary practitioners were duty bound to resist. But as things went forth, I mean, things moved from the British universities. As things started taking, like even Stuart Hall's CCCS, Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, even like when Stuart Hall took after Richard Hogarth, even then the British way of trying hard to differentiate how the everyday life, everything that is part of everyday life is not culture, as cultural studies thought of it in the beginning. But soon you will have, like, especially with Surtout, especially with Bourdieu or Lefebvre, you have everyday practices or everyday life being one of the very important components of thinking about culture. Now, I want us to look at that particular part, that particular point in history, this particular development in the evolution of uh, uh, in the evolution of the study of culture. And if it is about everyday life, what exactly has the pandemic done to our everyday life? The everyday life practices that we go through, the way in which we indulge with certain, I mean, not certain, generally, how do we indulge with several facets of culture? How many different tangents of culture do we differentially encounter uh, in the wake of pandemics? Apart from the fact that, I mean, I'm not talking about generally how we enjoy movies differently or how we enjoy literature differently. That is not that is like specifically culture, but the very everyday practice of having to move around, having to go to a shop and buy stuff, like do your writing or reading, like writing or reading part. Not I'm not talking about producing literature and consuming literature, like everyday practice of writing, storing, archiving, that particular thing, are tryst with the online identity. These facets have changed. These facets have completely changed. The standstill of economy and the way in which governments have failed or succeeded variably in different places in the resistance and like the production of vaccine and all those variables that medical discourse will have to basically answer about, how medical departments of the first world have failed in containing something like COVID-19, how Italy has failed, how US has failed, how Brazil had failed, how places like Philippines, how places like Indonesia, how places like New Zealand have been successful in containing COVID-19, how places like India, where the tests are still not being done as at a desirable rate, how India is going to struggle with states like India, governments like India, situations like India, cultural contexts like India are going to struggle with the outbreak of pandemic, and how our everyday will be completely reconfigured. I mean, this entire conference is called configuration, isn't it? This is like a configuration. So we need to seriously think about how we can address culture in that particular dimension, and probably also think of how cultural studies will stand differently, in 2 3 years of time. Uh, the way Susan Sontag pioneered it, we will need to completely rethink, we will need to completely reorganize, reformulate the ways in which we will address our cultural studies. As cultural studies has been incorporated into most of our syllabi, but we know cultural studies works uh, deviously. It works deceptively. What you find in the syllabus is not what cultural studies really is. Cultural studies defies, as Robert Johnson said, it perennially it is anxious to break into other forms of inquiries, like devious forms of inquiries, deceptive forms of inquiries, mysterious forms of inquiries which are situated in the interstices of disciplines, multiple disciplines. That is where cultural studies is found. So the pandemic will basically push our inquiries into these interstices. Like when we teach literature, like when we teach economics, like when we teach commerce, like when we live our everyday life, like when we watch movies, like when we use our cyber identities, like when we transact our politics, we will need to factor in something like a pandemic quotient, in the future. And my effort has been to list out a few tangents through which this could be realized. So, well, with that, uh, take up the questions that were posted, and I'll see if we have more to. I said this is like a scattered reflection. Of course, I mean I would have been more sure about the viewpoints if we were to talk about literature specifically, or movies specifically, or theater specifically. But no, I'm trying to like zoom out and keep literature, movies, theater in as components of something that I would brand as everyday practices. So if they are part of a larger everyday practice that is going to inform the very way in which we do research in cultural studies. The point is, the very fabric of cultural studies will have to be rethought in the context of uh, you know a pandemic like this and the cultural situation that it engendered.